All right, so maybe you still have your slides up from the last module. If so, you're going to click that class website button. It's going to take you to daisy.org, materials and schedule. And we are now down here at RStudio. Make sure this is full view. All right, so what the heck is this RStudio? What are we using? What's been going on here? So RStudio is also called an IDE, or an integrated development environment, which sounds like some technical jargon, and it kind of is. Basically, what it means is it's going to help you write code. It's not just a place where you have command line and you're just writing in code and it's not going to give you much back. In this case, we're going to have lots of different panes in RStudio that help us do lots of different things, and it's going to help us write code. So it's going to make suggestions for our code. It's going to help us view the output of our code. It's going to help us find errors. And it's not quite drop-down tool or a graphical user interface or GUI if you're used to those point and click programs, which are called GUIs or graphical user interfaces. But it does have some elements like that where we can point and click on things. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And RStudio is also the name of the company that makes a lot of the core packages that we're going to be using in the tidyverse. We'll talk more about that too, but they're now called Posit. So that's something useful to know. So again, it helps us do things easier in R, and it helps us with code completion, smart indentation. It will tell us when our parentheses aren't closed, which is a super duper common error. It'll tell us when we have some syntax errors potentially. It'll tell us about the files that we're working in and where we're working on our computer. It's going to help us look at plots and change the way in which we view our plots. And it's also going to give us access to information about documentation on packages and functions. In addition, it also has our ability to look at data itself, which we'll also look at. All right, so it should look something like this for you. There should have about 3 panes. You might have 4 panes if you've been working with an R Markdown file, which you might have open because of our labs. And so then your RStudio would look something like this. And so what I just did there to open that Markdown file was either go to File and select it from the File pane where I can say File, New File, R Markdown, or I could simply press this little white square button, the green plus sign, which is the New File plus button, and I can select R Markdown. When I do that, I'll get a little pop-up, which you may have seen briefly. It looks something like this. The defaults are all fine. You don't really need to worry about that. And you can just say, okay. And then we have those 4 panes that we've been seeing potentially. All right. So this top pane that we're seeing, if you have your RStudio set up the same way, which is the default settings, and maybe you've been using R for a bit and you have slightly different setup, and we'll go through that, how you can fix that. But typically by default, you'll have your RMD files up here on the left corner, and you'll have your console down here. So this is called the editor or the source, and it keeps a static copy of your code. So it's really good for keeping a history of what you've been doing. The bottom here, the console, is sort of our interactive place to do calculations, maybe try something out. And once we decide, yeah, I like this code, we might want to save it in the top part in our editor, and we'll look into what that looks like. So this is where we might have our files open, like our scripts or our RMD files. And that's where we're going to have our code and our comments. And remember, Ava taught us that comments are something that starts with a hashtag in front of them. In our Markdown files, hashtags can do some other fancier things, which we'll see as well. But inside of our code, we can do something like this. If you like running commands directly, you can highlight things and press Command Enter or Control Enter, depending on what kind of computer you have. And we'll see some more of that. But you might be familiar with opening scripts. And if you open a script file, it's going to look something like this. So I can do that here as well. I would press that little button. And instead of R Markdown, I'd press that first option, R Script. And notice I get a completely empty, just white square file, whereas my RMD file has a bunch of stuff in it already. All right. As a reminder, the part at the bottom called the console is again where we test things, but anything that we do here is not really going to be saved. So this can cause a lot of problems for people where they maybe think that they saved something, but it was actually, in fact, just run live in their console. So anytime you think like this code might be worth saving, you're going to want to go up to your RMD file and do that. There's a ton of buttons and things that you can do in RStudio. I honestly don't even think I know all of them, and I've been working in RStudio for a really long time. And you don't really need to know all of them, but many of them can be really helpful, and we're gonna point out the really helpful things. But if you ever get lost or you want to learn more, there's this really helpful cheat sheet that you can use that can describe all the various pieces. All right. So we talked about how all these R Markdown files look different from a script. They've got stuff in them already, right? They've got these gray boxes. They've got blue text with hashtags. They've got black text. There's a lot going on here. And our script was kind of boring and empty. So you may already have been working with scripts or you know people that use them, and they can be useful for certain uses. They're helpful for maybe running something that's programmatic where you want to run something repeatedly. But for data analyses, it's really helpful to use an R Markdown file because we're going to want to typically test pieces of our code. We're going to want to document things about our code, and we can do that so much better in an R Markdown file than we can in a script. All right. We've also seen this environment pane. So that's where we're going to see things that are stored into memory that we can use currently in our session of R. So for example, we used this piece of code previously where my num was assigned to the value, or 2 was assigned to the value my num. So this object, my num, is now in my environment, and I can see that it has a single value of 2. All right, so the workspace or environment here tells us what objects we have loaded into memory. So what things can we work with in R? That's what our objects are. We have a history pane here that does tell us the various commands that we've used, but we really recommend that you don't typically rely on them because it can be very confusing. Like if you're trying to find something that was, this long ago, it's really hard to figure out which exact command it was. So it's much better to write down your code inside of your R Markdown, which will look something like this. That being said, we can do a nifty thing in the console where we can click the up arrow and it's going to show us previous commands that we've done, which can be helpful if we want to just adjust something. All right, we have some other helpful panes here. This lower right pane here has a lot of useful things in it. So we have a file viewer, which yours is probably going to look a little bit different from mine. I have a bunch of subdirectories where we're keeping all of the things from the course. Maybe you're on your desktop or something like that. We've got a plot pane, which is going to show our plots and we get to making plots. A package pane, this shows us the packages that we have available. So packages that we have loaded into memory. I've used quite a few here. We've got the help pane, which helps us to search various functions and packages. So I can do things like this, and I can look up things on the tidyverse. I have something called Git because I'm using that, but you might not have that, and that's okay. That's because I added something special. Don't worry about that. And the viewer pane can help us take a look at things more deeply. But the main helpful ones are this help button and our plots and files. All right, so if your RStudio isn't looking like mine and you want it to match, there's this little pane layout button that kind of looks like a waffle. Surprisingly hard word for me to say. So this waffle is up here. I'm from New Mexico. Maybe we have a weird accent in that way. I'm like just noticing that. But anyway, if you click on here, you'll see that it says pane layout. You can click that and you can rearrange things so that it looks like mine. So I've got the source or editor on the top, console on the left bottom, environment history, etc. This is all the default settings. So if you have used the default, you don't need to worry about it. Then you can get out of there by clicking that button. All right. So if you want to look further later, you can come back and see what the default options are. If things are changed, they're in the slides. All right. Now we're gonna do a little more directly in RStudio. So we've already opened a lab file. So that's a pretty simple one for us. If you're having trouble figuring out where your downloads are and where to get to things, we have a couple of videos. See, it can help you navigate your computer. If you have a Mac, we have a different video for you as well. We noticed that some people were having some issues opening files in RStudio if they have a Mac. So you might have to do what Elizabeth, can you describe how you overcame that again?
Yeah, it just seemed to be that when people opened RStudio and then tried to load an RMD from their downloads for the first time, the two were not speaking to each other. So it was pretty straightforward to solve. They closed out, actually closed down, shut down RStudio, and then right-clicked the RMD file, said open with RStudio, and then they had to just give permission for these types of files to be open with RStudio in the future.
Great. That's a really good point though for troubleshooting. If RStudio is just behaving strangely, it's often a good idea to just restart RStudio. That has fixed a ton of problems. All right. So again, these R Markdown files are super helpful because they help us describe our code. They allow us to check the output of our code. And we can actually make these really fancy reports from them that can be a variety of different file types. And so we can kind of think of them as fancier scripts. So I'm going to get rid of this script because I don't want to use it. I'm not a huge fan of that for data analysis. Again, if you want to figure out how to open one again, it's File, New File, or R Markdown, or you can click that green button to do it. Okay, so the most important part of an R Markdown file is something called a chunk. It's got a really technical name, a chunk. And these code chunks are where you're going to actually put your code. So the code should really be inside these gray boxes. So automatically, when we create a new R Markdown file, we're going to have a chunk that already has some code in it. So I didn't do anything. I just made this R Markdown file. You saw me do it in front of you. I already have this chunk here, and it's got some code in it. You'll notice that everything around the chunks is just sort of describing what's going on here. So we've got text saying what this file is, how this works. And we've got a header here that has these two hashtags in front of it. There's this play button that's going to allow me to run the current chunk. So that's going to play all of the code that's in that chunk. So when I press that, I'll see this little green bar that we just saw flash on the screen, which was showing the progress of the code. And I'll see that not only did it run the code up here and it's displaying the resulting output, but it also ran the code in my console. So some people hate having to do the clicking. And so if you don't want to do that, you can do a keyboard shortcut, which is Control Enter or Command Enter, depending on if you have a Windows or a Mac machine. So you can highlight a line of code and then run those keyboard shortcuts. All right, so when we are actually running the chunk, we're actually executing the code, meaning that code is being run on the computer. It's evaluating what the code is trying to do. And again, we're going to see those results in the console as well. Ava really hates having the code preview in the markdown file. I don't mind it. If you don't want to see the preview, you can get rid of it. There's a help page on the website that shows you how to do this, but you can go to, hopefully this didn't change, they're always changing RStudio, but tools, global options, no, that's the same, and then R Markdown. Go down to R Markdown, and where it says show output inline for all Markdown documents, if you don't like that, you can just unclick it. And then you'll want to press apply to make sure that the changes are applied. But I'm going to keep it. All right. And then there's a very important button on our Markdown files called the knit button, which looks like a ball of yarn with, I'm like slowly learning the yarn jargon here, with the knitting needle, right? That's right, Elizabeth. And so you'll see that here, this little knit button, and it can do some exciting things. So it's going to help me run all of the chunks in my RMD file. It might ask me to name my RMD file. And I'm going to see it do a bunch of things, rendering. Can you see it pop up the file? I'm not sure if it did that for you, so let me click an additional share. Mine's going to look slightly different from yours. Can you see it now? Ooh,
Yeah, I
you
think
don't
you just have
see.
to rearrange the windows. Yeah, see it now.
Oh, okay. So yours won't have this appear. It's because the code that we have showing you everything is embedded in the code that we use to make the website. But yours will look something like this, where you'll have maybe untitled and information. And we're going to be testing this out in our lab, so don't worry. But you can see that it makes this really nice output of the code, the output of the code, all of this information. So it makes a really nice report. So this is what yours should look like. And this is great because you can send it to your colleagues and they just have to open it in a browser. So this is a .html file and they can open it in their browser and see an interactive document. If we want to add a new chunk, there's a button here that can help us do that. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to close this one out. I'm now in RStudio. Can everyone see that? Cool, cool, cool. All right, so I've decided I want to add another chunk. I'm gonna go to the right place inside my RMD, so I don't want to be inside my text or anything like that. I don't want to be inside another chunk. That could cause problems. But I'm on an empty line here. And I'm gonna press that chunk button. And you can actually work in Python. For those of you, I know someone has been working on Python or in Python. You can work in different languages in RStudio as well. So, but we're going to want to work with R, and notice that it makes this chunk here, this gray box. It's got these little back ticks that are sort of making the border of the chunk. So if I add more lines, you can see that I get a bigger chunk space, and these curly brackets tell us that we're using the language R. Again, if you like those keyboard shortcuts, there's an option for that. Control Alt I or Command Option I, where I stands for insert. If you like all these keyboard shortcuts and you don't want to have to go through our notes, you can go to the resource page and there's some keyboard shortcuts found right here for you. All right, there's another really, really important button called the Run Previous chunk button, and it's right next to the play button. So you can kind of think of this, gray arrow telling us I'm going to run all of the chunks before and I'll stop at this chunk. So it's not going to play the current chunk, but it's going to play all the previous chunks. So for example, maybe I have a chunk here. Ava's on my mind. So I don't have Ava in my environment yet. So if I press this button here, it's going to run the previous chunks. Notice that it reevaluated this previous chunk here, but it did not run this chunk. So I do not have Ava in my environment. So in order to do that, I have to press the play button for this specific chunk. Really important button though, because you'll notice in later stages, you'll have lots of previous chunks and it's very annoying to go in and press each one. So you don't need to do that. All right, it's also a really great way to make sure that you're not missing a piece of code where you did something interactively in your console, but you didn't save it. And so now it's not going to all cohesively work. So it's a good idea to be pressing that button to recheck things. Okay, errors. So errors will present in RStudio like this. So here we have an extra or excessive parentheses here that we don't need. Because remember, most of our functions just have like one set of parentheses around things, like here in our summary cars. So I will create an error here where I've added an extra parentheses as well. Notice I'm getting this little red underlined thing here where it's like, things seem a bit questionable. I'm not sure about this. And then when I try to run it, notice that I get this error and this information that I have an unexpected parentheses. Not all error messages are helpful. This one's pretty dang helpful though. Note that sometimes your error is much earlier. Maybe it's in an earlier chunk, like you forgot to make an object and save it to memory or something like that. So it may not be solvable from the chunk that you're working on. Okay, so more helpful shortcuts if you want to move from the from the console to your editor, you can move back and forth as well using shortcuts. Or again, the most important one, evaluating a line of code, which is Control Enter or Command Enter. And there's the link again for shortcuts. Okay, so just very important recap of where the code goes. Your code is going to go either in the console to test things, but once you've decided you like it, you're going to put it inside that R chunk. You don't want it outside the R chunk because you can't evaluate it. You want it inside the gray boxes. Okay, we can also get really great help. So when we start to type a package or function name, I'm going to squish this just a little bit. So for example, if I start to hesitate, I'll get information from RStudio. So it's showing me that class is from the base R packages, meaning it comes with the installation of R, and it's telling me information about what it does. Or alternatively, I can see more information about, other functions like this. And it's going to give me information about arguments and all sorts of things that I might need. Again, we can also type it into that help tab if we want. So I can go to help and we can type it in here. And we can use question marks. We're not quite sure and we want to get some help, extra help with something. And that's basically going to search for it in our help pane. So let's say I'm interested in the readr package. I guess I don't have that loaded in memory. There we go. Then I'll need two question marks. If I have a function, so that's a package. If I have a function, I can do one. I already have this loaded in memory because it's a Bezier function. I can do one question mark and it's going to pull up the documentation. Again, it's the same as just typing it into the search box here, but it can be nice to be able to do that quickly from the command here. Again, so we need that double question mark if it's for a package name, and maybe we don't have it in memory yet. These can be really helpful options for finding documentation and understanding how we're supposed to run our code. So for example, we already have our class information up here. It's going to tell me the arguments that I need. And importantly, if I scroll all the way down, it's going to give me actual examples of things I could do. Sometimes they're helpful, depends on the package and who wrote it. Okay, so in summary, RStudio makes working in R easier. The editors where our markdown files are by default. If we have a different setup and we want to change it, or we don't like the default, we can click that waffle button and the pane layout button. The console is where we test code. The R Markdown documents are incredibly helpful because they can help us test our code by evaluating it, making sure that our code is correct, that all of the code that we need is correct. So when we run something from a chunk, we're using everything that's in our environment. But when we press the knit button, it's going to start a new environment. So everything has to be inside your RMD file that would be required for it to work. So it's a slightly different process than running a code chunk. So both of them help us check our code and make sure that it's working, and also enable us to see the output of our results, which is really useful when we're looking at data. I also said I'd tell you about actually looking at the data itself. So, for example, we can also type in data. We'll be doing this a lot in the course, but here I'm assigning a data set here. And we'll see that we can press a button like this to get information about what variables we have in our data set. We'll see more of that later. Here I clicked a little bit to the right. It's going to display that data frame. Okay. But the most important thing, code goes inside the chunk. If you want to do something fancy, there's extra information in here about how you can modify the code chunks so that they display the code or they don't, if you want to do really fancy reports. Any questions? How do we save our work? Yeah, so it's important to, again, save your code in these RMD files. Notice right now that my RMD file is red. If I'm happy with my code here, I could press save. And, I probably want to save my RMD file to something other than untitled, but that will save all my code for next time. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so we have a simple lab here just to play around with RStudio a bit more and get comfortable, and we're going to be doing a lot more in RStudio in the days to come. So Ava put the lab file there. So we'll click on that, download it, and it should open up our lab file to work in.
All right, we ready for breakout rooms?
Mhm.
Okay, let's do it. All right, hey everyone. So let's get just a little bit of practice playing around with RStudio, just some of the features that it has. Okay, so I am on the website and I want to go to materials and schedule and grab that RStudio RMD file. All right, you're welcome to save this file or just close it out, up to you. All right, I'll give us a minute to open this up. And let me know if your file doesn't look like this or you're having any issues opening it up. All right. And I mentioned a little bit earlier how you can clean your environment. You can get rid of all of these objects. I'm going to just do that to keep things tidy. So now if I wanted to, prompt up that vector I made, I got rid of it, right? So I'd have to remake it. Okay. So not so important that we know, what exactly is going on here, but rather that, we have some text, we have a mix of text and code going on here, and we just want to run the code. So we're, maybe a colleague wrote this and sent it to you, and you're just like trying to see if it'll run, right? We're not too worried yet about what the contents of the code are. Just trying to see, how we would run this code. Okay, so we're gonna compile first this document using the knit button and try to see what files are produced. So I'm going to go up here and knit to HTML or just hit the knit button. And if you had that file in your downloads like me, so this is kind of what I see here, it just created this file, RStudio Lab. And if I open that up, it makes this HTML document that opens up in my browser. I got a bunch of stuff here. I haven't really like figured out what's going on yet, but it made a whole document for me, which is pretty cool. Anyone not seeing the knit button or having issues hitting that button and having it complete, like any errors or anything like that we're seeing? All right. Can we get a thumbs up for successful HTML file produced when we hit that button? Okay, we've got a couple. Okay, great. All right, so let's play with the code a little bit. The gray area is a code chunk. It's going to run some code. It's going to set up the packages we need. It's got a data set and it contains some county level data about ER visits in Colorado. So heat related illnesses. And not so important that we know what the code is doing quite yet, but we could run it and see what happens. So what happens in the environment and what happens in general. All right. So it looks like some code ran in the console, which is pretty interesting, right? It evaluated some stuff. It might have, for you in your settings, it might have run underneath this chunk. That's totally fine. And I now have two objects in my environment. And these are a little bit more complicated objects, right? It's saying observations and variables rather than just like telling me the value is 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that. So they're a little bit more complicated. All right. Okay, so we have another chunk down here that's going to make a plot of some data. And let's say we, got rid of all of our objects. We cleaned up our console
And we wanted to run all the chunks above. So this is really good in case, you maybe deleted an object or like, you reassigned something, but maybe want to go back and backtrack a little bit. So let's run the run all chunks above button. That's this one right next to the play button. So it's going to run that chunk that we just did up that's up in the file a little bit. And maybe we want to run this next one that produces some plots. Very cool. So again, this code may look a little bit scary for now, but it's eventually going to help us create a plot. Yeah, that's the preference thing that Carrie was talking about. Like,
Okay.
personally, I don't like it below the chunk because, like, I'm like, we have a perfectly good plots page. Yeah, so I pinned in the Slack in the October 2024 session. There is that help page that you can
Okay.
change those settings. Yeah, of course, totally personal preference. The plot will be the same. So let's add a new R chunk after this line right here. Your code chunk goes here. And we can do that with this button here. Or we could do Command Control I or Command Option I think, to create that chunk, or we can just use the drop-down menu. And let's put a lowercase r inside. So if I run this chunk and then this chunk, I'm kind of separating out that code to both store the value, that vector, and then print out that vector. And so now if I were to knit again and then go check out that file, let's refresh it. I should be able to scroll down and see that X that I added. So it's seeing another chunk, this other chunk that I added, and recognizing that I asked it to kind of just print out that X. Yeah. So all chunks
Okay.
above. Yeah. There, I don't think there's a run previous. You can do next. So there's some variation, if you are really wanting some specific, but typically I use this one and then I run that current one if I'm gonna be working with the buttons and everything.